and welcome to the latest Retire Well episode with me, Matthew. And as always, I'm joined by Joe. And today we're going to be looking at a popular question is, can you retire early? A lot of people want to retire early, and a lot of people, when they're talking to colleagues at work, it's that idea of, how much is enough and how quickly can I transition from working full time to whatever retirement means for someone. Again, we know talking to people, there can be lots of different types of retirement. So it could be just carrying on working or, taking on a new hobby or a new course. So really, in today's episode, we're going to chat through the areas that people should think about and look at when they come to financially, can they afford to retire? And then also unpick some of the psychological bits as well.
Yeah, I think people have always wanted to retire early. It's not anything that's new. And most people want to sort of stop work as soon as possible and then get on sort of enjoying the rest of their life. But I think particularly with some things that have happened over the past few years, COVID has potentially give some people time to reflect, realise that there is more to life than just working, change a little bit in working patterns as well, looking at sort of remote work and sort of the extra time that you have in your day. And then I suppose also the rise of the cost of living, although is maybe a negative to being able to retire early, it just gives people a little bit of context on sort of what they can do. So we find quite a lot of people that are exploring sort of options to retire before state pension age, and state pension age is only sort of going to start increasing when we sort of look at it moving to 68, and then potential further reviews going on there. So people sort of don't want to be reliant on the state pension. They want to sort of be in control of their own finances and almost give them permission to retire sort of as and when they want. So today we'll obviously run through sort of UK pension rules, a little bit of the investment and tax planning considerations that you might want to look at retiring early, and sort of how does that differ from working all the way to state pension age and stopping.
Definitely. And I think it's an interesting one because everyone's retirement's different, but equally we can talk through the messages we get from helping a lot of people explore it and essentially go in what used to be a pension that was divided almost evenly across a full life expectancy. Now, do you use that upfront? Do you focus on more chapters? Are you trying to take more income in the early years? So we can sort of pick through that and look at it. But we'll start with the Jargon Buster, which is a popular one at the minute where a few people have said, tax on various things is, coming more into the light as Labour possibly need to raise more funds to fill that black hole. And one of the questions we've had recently is, what is the tax on savings interest? So do you want to jump into that one, Joe?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is one that a lot of people can be concerned at, particularly if they've got sort of a large cash holding, because it's becoming more and more easy to pay, particularly with higher interest rates as well. If we'd looked at it previously when you're getting sort of 0 or 1%, it's less of an issue. I always like to phrase it as a good problem to have, because if you're starting to be taxed on saving interest, it means that you are earning some amount of interest there. And then I'd also maybe sort of, without sort of jumping into the jargon straight away, look at sort of how much you actually need in cash, which is something we've always spoke about. And most people probably won't need the amount that would actually generate the tax on savings interest there, and could potentially reduce it down. But with saving interest, it's taxed in the same way that sort of income tax is taxed. You will sort of have your personal savings allowance, and some people will have an additional amount as well if they don't have other income above that sort of standard personal allowance of income tax as well. Currently, 2.6 million people are paying tax on their savings interest, which is a good portion of sort of the adult population. But a couple of figures they're expecting that to sort of quadruple over the next few years as more people sort of have cash if interest rates stay the same. But crucially, the government have had a look at this, because currently it's very much a bit of a finger in the air from sort of banks and potentially HMRC in how much people actually have in their savings accounts and what level of interest they have. And it's not always reported. Technically, you should be filling out a self-assessment form if you've got a certain amount of savings interest, but it's not that strict at the moment. So the government have essentially said they're going to bring in, whenever you are opening savings accounts, you'll have to provide your national insurance number from 2027 in the same way that you would with pensions and ISAs. And then the banks will essentially report into HMRC a little bit more. So it's going to become a little bit more strict from now on.
I think the crucial bit currently is that there can be a misconception that tax on interest is treated in the same way as PAYE income. So there's a view that when someone's been earning, the right amount of a tax is adjusted through their salary so that they don't have to do anything extra unless they go over a specific threshold and they're a high earner. With interest from a bank, it's being paid gross essentially, and then it's get to the point when you go over the threshold, as Joe mentions, there's a requirement to do a self-assessment, and that's almost, as we've seen allowances squeezed and we've seen tax things not being increased in line with inflation, you've had more people impacted and more people being pushed into that doing the self-assessment. So I think it's an area that certainly stresses people out. And I had a new client recently who essentially had sold a property, had a lot of money in cash, was then unaware that she should have been paying tax and should have been doing a self-assessment. And essentially she might have had poor advice. I think she spoke to someone, an accountant at some point, and it didn't quite happen to ended up being submitted and that sort of thing. So, for her, when we look at the advice picture, actually the important bit isn't necessarily the tax side of things, and it isn't the interest. It's more, what do you want to do with the money? Is it to be used for the long term? Is it to be used for investments? Is it going to be gifted? And actually, it can be moved from that holding account that's paying that interest and causing the tax problem for her to do something more and be the enabler. But I think the first thing there is for someone to have a good idea of how much interest they're earning in the year, to know if they're above the thresholds and whether there is any tax requirements for them, or can they move that into ISAs or investments?
Yeah, and just before I move on, we will sort of quickly run through the thresholds there. So the sort of personal savings allowance for a high rate taxpayer is 1,000. Basic rate taxpayer is 1,000. High rate taxpayer is 500. And then you've obviously got the standard personal allowance of 12,570.
Yeah.
If you have less than that in other income, you may also be eligible for the starting rate for savings of 5,000. So I suppose if you've got no other income at all, you could potentially be looking at sort of 18,570 of savings income that you could tax. But in all honesty, it's rare that you'd have that sort of situation.
Yeah, definitely. And I think if you're going over any of those figures, it's worth just a sense check. It's worth a conversation with an accountant, with a financial advisor, just to say, could this cash be better working for me, or is it in the right place? And that's where that comes on to the next bit, and perfectly pulls into it the idea of, if someone has a large cash balance and they're thinking about retirement, can they retire early? Can they use it to subsidise us, and to think about what we want to do? So jumping onto the sort of main topic today is, what does retirement look like? And I think you probably agree that we see lots of different shades of retirement, different priorities, but really it's the idea of, okay, I don't want to work full time and I want to change from what I'm doing into a balance or some flexibility.
Yeah, you come across all sort of reasons for retiring. So some people have that real drive to retire and they've got that plan and it's about getting the money behind them to be able to do it. Some people, quite frankly, just sick of the job and want to sort of get out of that. And that might be a time for reflection and full retirement or potential partial retirement. And some people also as well are financially ready to retire. And then they almost trigger that sort of early retirement discussion from, well, I've got enough. I might not actually be sort of ready to retire sort of mentally, but I've got enough, so I might as well have the conversation and look at it that way. So you come across all sorts of different reasons, and I'm sure we can sort of explore a few of them throughout the course of the episode.
Yeah, of course. I think it's that element of going, sometimes it's driven by not enjoying work. Sometimes it's been driven, as you say, by I've got enough, so I'm ready for the new chapter. And sometimes people love their job, but it's just a case of, well, I'll have more flexibility or more of my own time and be able to prioritize the bucket list. So I think, as you mentioned, we're going to move on to some case studies later on where we'll talk through examples of how pensions have worked. But in reality, when we're talking to someone about early retirement, what are we saying? We're saying, okay, how much do you think you're going to need in retirement, and how is that going to change over time? What sort of lump sums do you see yourself needing? Again, have you got any debt to pay off? Are you going to move house? Do you want to upgrade the car at a certain point? Do you want to gift to family members? Basically modeling what retirement could look like. And then we're also looking at what assets someone's got already. So we might say, what pensions have you got? What investments? What cash have you got? Are you going to have any inheritance? Are there any other things coming through into the system that we should factor in? And then we can start to say, is that income desired? Is that achievable? Do we need to work longer? Is there any opportunity costs that we're outweighing? Obviously, if someone chooses to retire currently at 55 and accesses the pension, they're going to be using it over a lot longer period than if they work to 60 or 65. So again, those are the bits that we're sort of teasing out to say, what is the biggest priority? Is it the guarantee that income will see someone throughout their whole retirement, or is it the early spending power, the flexibility? Does that have more of a priority?
Yeah, and I think it's changed since pension freedoms came in, and you could actually take your pension more flexibly, and that allows us to do exactly what you've said there, where if people do have, and quite a lot, I mean, most people will have some form of state pension to come in, but equally there will be quite a lot of legacy defined benefit pensions that, although in the main aren't as active now and most people don't have them, they will have them some sort of previous employment a lot of the time. And that almost is almost an interim gap between the state pension a lot of the time. You might be able to access your defined benefit pension from 60 or 65, which means any flexible pensions that you have might only need to take you 5 years or 100% for 5 years and then 50% to get yourself to state pension. And that sort of gap to state pension as well, I mean, as I said at the start, it's not planned to be ever increasing, but we have seen it over sort of recent years. I mean, most people now will have that 67 moving on to 68 for some of the younger viewers.
And the logic being that it ticks up in line with the average life expectancy. So, that period, some people might say, oh, it's unfair that the state pension age is getting further and further back. Well, that seems to be, it's pegged with life expectancy. And then the minimum pension age is also pegged with that state pension age. So we're almost saying the expectation is that people will work longer because they'll live longer, and then they'll be taking their state pension for roughly the same amount of time. So there is logic to it, but equally, I think people who are on the cusp, again, when we think about the WASPy women and other people who've been impacted by those changes, if you thought that you were going to be accessing your pension at 65 or 67, and then actually your state pension was moved back a year or a transitional amount, you can feel that that's almost had an undue impact on your retirement.
Yeah, I think, again, with sort of the deficit the UK's got at the moment and the autumn budget coming up, there will be a lot of talk with regards to pension changes generally. And then there may be some sort of paper talk with regards to that state pension and what might happen to it. People are always talking about whether the triple lock will stay. As we mentioned before, Matthew said sort of the perfect time that would to do it during COVID with high inflation, but it'll always be sort of there as a question, and then also pushing it back. And sort of last episode when we looked about adapting your plan, I think most people, if you're getting your state pension in payment, I'd be pretty confident, and I never like having a crystal ball, but I'd be pretty confident in saying that you'd most likely have legacy protection in place there. But it's one to think about, because obviously if you're planning on retiring now, but your state pension's not from 15 years, you're almost outside of that sort of 10-year potential horizon where the government will likely give notice of any changes.
Yeah, I think you have to rely on the rules as they stand and the pensions as they stand. So for that point, if someone's hitting pension age now, say they're retiring at 60, can they rely on the state pension? Well, they have to. Otherwise, what are they going to rely on? But you also don't want to put all your eggs in one basket. So as you described earlier, having your own financial destiny in your hands, having the flexibility, having a pension fund that's invested, having ISAs, having cash, that gives you the ability to adapt your plan, as we say. And if the triple lock was removed tomorrow, would that impact your retirement? Well, you know that that's going to go up, but maybe not as high every year from state pension age. So you just basically have to have a little bit more powder dry in the pension or in the ISAs to see through what you might need. But it wouldn't mean that you'd have to carry on working, for example. So I think that's the balance, really. Yeah.
So I mean, we've talked about a lot of things there. There's obviously a lot of stuff to think about when you're thinking about early retirement, from tax efficiency to longevity and investment performance as well. What we'll do now is sort of start to run through some case studies that'll hopefully, maybe you'll be able to see bits of yourself in them and might help with that sort of decision-making process going forward on whether an early retiment's right for you.
Yeah, definitely. And I think we'd like to have, comments about where people are in their retirement journey and other bits for us to pick off going forward. But in general, we've helped a lot of people go through the financial and psychological bits of this. So, as you say, it's likely that they're going to see themselves in one or two of the case studies.
So case study one that we're going to look at to start off with is going to be looking at sort of relocation, which is something that isn't always the most common, but can also sort of help with potentially achieving that early retirement. I mean, the common one would be someone that's working in London or potentially some of the more expensive areas down in the southeast, and sort of moving to a lesser expensive area. I mean, the northeast is a common one. Obviously there you reduce your overall costs in sort of your day-to-day spend, but equally you can free up a good amount of equity potentially within your property, which might give you that little bit extra that you need to get over the line and achieve that early retirement.
Definitely. I think when we come to that question of how much is enough, we're often thinking how much is enough in a pension or how much is enough in investments. But there are situations like this where you can have someone saying, okay, my property value has gone up over years, and now, I don't have to be based in London, or I don't have to be based in the south because, I used to be there for work a lot, but now I can pick wherever I want to be and I can essentially have a hub. And I was talking through a situation exactly like that with a gentleman recently, where essentially he says, surely enough is enough when I look at my numbers now, and a large chunk of that was property values. So my usual starting point in that conversation would be to say, okay, that's not liquid funds. That's not funds that we can model for retirement. That's the roof over your head. So we should focus on your pensions, your investments to get the income you need. But when he's then happy to downsize and move and can potentially release about, 400 or 500,000 pounds worth of equity, that is a really kickstart for the model. And especially when we're describing the chapters that you might want to access pensions in, and between retiring at, say, 57 and the state pension age, we know there's that window. If in that period you're going to use a bit of flexi access drawdown, if you're going to use a bit of ISAs, and if you're also going to use some of your cash, then actually it makes it a lot easier to say, from a tax efficient point of view, which tap do I use? The tough bit, I guess, is how much can you take from the cash and what period? So again, that's almost saying, going back to our previous episode of looking at bucketing, what do I want to keep in the short-term pot for now? And what am I happy to invest into the model to then be drawn down over those various chapters?
Yeah, I suppose, this is an ideal scenario really that doesn't happen a great deal of time, but I think it's really good from a sort of a taxation perspective potentially, because if you've got sort of a large sum that's not yet in a pension, and as part of this you might look at sort of contributing more to a pension and contributing more to an ISA. But if you, as you said, look at your sort of short-term expenses, and we talk a lot of the time about clients wanting to really enjoy those first 5 years and sometimes more of retirement. And if you've got everything that's in a pension, that can actually become quite tax inefficient, because if you're wanting to spend more than sort of 50,000, you'll potentially be paying higher rate tax there, or you'll be drawing on more of your tax-free cash in the early years, which knock on down the line when you've got a state pension coming in and you're trying to sort of generate an income can really constrain you in how tax efficient you can be. So it's a nice way where you can essentially look at this. I would say more often than not, this sort of thing would happen organically as opposed to something that you would plan for, where you might have friends and family that all live in one area of the country and you previously moved away, as opposed to I don't think this often happens as a purely financial decision. What are your thoughts on
I think, I agree with you. I think I don't see someone's main residence or their property as a financial asset to be used for a retirement journey. So it's more as part of my retirement chapter, I'm thinking about relocating, so this will therefore release cash. People often do say, when the kids go to university, when they become self-sufficient, we don't need a 5-bedroom house, so we can downsize. So there is an element of, might not be changing geographical location, but there is an element of sometimes, liquidity coming into a model as a plan. But most of the time, how much is that going to be? What house are you going to buy? It's hard to rely on. And I've had a conversation quite a lot with people recently where the idea of downsizing doesn't release any money. The idea of buying a bungalow might be the dream for people in retirement, in the later chapter especially, but that might cost just as much as the 4-bedroom house that they currently live in. So I think there's an element of you can't rely on that liquidity necessarily. But equally, if I was to flip that case study the other way round, we've had a client who's lived in the Northeast, lived in Sunderland, and their dream was to move to the Lake District. And when it came to it, they had their house up on the market and they weren't quite getting the offer they wanted to get that dream house that they found and had an offer accepted on. And we would talk to them a little bit, and they were really beating themselves up to say, we just need another 5 or 10 grand on what someone will pay for ours to get this house and we might lose it. When we talked it through, we said, hang on a second, you've got that money in the pension, you've got that money in the ISA. If that is your top priority in retirement and that's where you want to be based, let's not worry too much about the 5 grand or the 10 grand on the price for your selling point, because if it's been on the market for a period of time and the estate agent doesn't think you're going to get it, we're not going to find it that way. But by accessing the pension or the ISA, they actually were able to get the property and they're now loving life there. And it's that opportunity cost of saying, do you want to potentially miss out on the perfect house for the sake of £5,000 or £10,000, or over a 30-year retirement? Is that a very small amount? So it can work both ways. From a helping someone to jump into an early retirement, releasing the funds obviously helps on that case study, but equally, when George Osborne stood up and talked about pension freedoms, it can go the other way, which I think can be quite powerful as well.
Yeah, I think we should probably spend more time on main residences and how they may be used in retirement, sort of, in maybe in a dedicated episode, looking at sort of downsizing and looking at potentially equity release later in retirement and care fees. But for now, I think that sort of explored that case study quite nicely. Moving on to the second one, a lot of the time we talk about sort of planning as a couple and how you can potentially use joint sort of allowances, particularly when one retires earlier than another. But it's not always the case. So this one, we're going to look at a single individual that's potentially looking to bridge the gap between 55 and the state pension age. And they've essentially just got sort of flexible income available, and sort of what potential things should we be thinking about with regards to that?
Yeah, I think this is a case where you almost think, how much will they need? And I think the key bit there is, what's their essential expenditure? What's the bills? Is there any debt? What's the council tax? What's the gas and electricity? What do they need coming in every month just to keep the lights on? Then you've got the element of, what do you want to do in retirement? How do they want to thrive? Is it going to be holidays? Is it going to be cars? What's their main driver in their sort of hobbies and interests? And with those sorts of figures together, we can then start to say, well, how much do they need in the early chapter to tick off those bits? And then, when we go back to the TAP analogy, how much of that can come from a pension? Well, actually, you don't want to be taking too much from a pension too early and losing the tax efficiency of it over the long term. And that's where an ISA or shares or cash can bridge that gap, especially for the first few years in retirement. So they can start to say, if I'm going to use some of my tax-free cash, some ISA and cash in the first 10 years, well, then I know if it's 55, they're going to be, closer to that state pension age, and then they know the next chapter's coming.
Yeah, and equally, depending on how old this client is, that 55 goal might not actually be pension access age, because with it sort of increasing to 57 in 2028, might be a thought of, well, do I need more outside of the pensions to fund me for those couple of years? And that, again, that's where we'd look at your current pensions, see if you do have any sort of protection against that moving from 55 to 57 that they do. If not, definitely need to be looking more down the stocks and shares route, but potentially even looking at sort of investment bonds or something like that could provide you that sort of additional investment vehicle, nice tax efficient income in those early years before you can start to draw on potentially the big hitter of a personal pension.
Yeah, and I think the crucial bit with this one is, if we're having a conversation with someone at 55, they have to have had enough for us to then press the button. If not, we're then saying, do you want to take a compromise on your spending and your standard of living, or do you want to work a bit longer? And that's the sort of conversation. If we're having a conversation with someone who's, say, in their 40s with a plan to retire at 55, you've got a lot more, okay, well, if we do this now and if we save more, if we have some regular saving, this is what the impact can look like. And, one client really sticks in my mind there as someone who retired at 52 using shares and cash to bridge the gap between 52 and that minimum pension age. And then by doing that, He then unlocked the pension to then see him through but till state pension. And that's really worked perfectly for him. He was a guy who worked offshore, so he accumulated a lot of funds to compensate him for being away from his family and the more high-risk job there. But when COVID came along, that was the real eye-opener for him, where it was a case of, that was the most time he'd ever spent at home with his family, and actually he quite liked it. So therefore he was like, I was planning to work a bit longer, but actually is enough? I think I've got enough. And whilst I'm too young to access my pension, I have also saved those shares, the ISAs, the funds to bridge me through that first gap.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting point that you make of sort of when someone actually comes and speaks to us. A lot of the time I'll speak to sort of initial clients, and they might be 1 or maybe 2 years away from when they're planning to retire. And the first thing they'll say is, I'm not sure if it's too soon to be thinking about it, but is it something that you can help me with? I mean, there's the saying, the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, second best times now. I think it's similar in financial advice, even if it's the case where you don't necessarily need an advisor as much, but you need someone that sort of can set you on the plan on sort of an ongoing basis, and you can get all your ducks in a row and you can get the most tax efficient thing in. A lot of the time we can be a little bit limited in what we can do when you're only sort of 1 or 2 years away from retirement, because it might be with a couple, you've got someone that's got much more in a pension than another, or you might only have certain tax wrappers. So I think sort of accessing advice early can be really, really valuable to set you on that right path for early retirement.
Yeah, and I think it's also the sense check. I think, if someone's 5 years away or 10 years away from retirement, you just want the sense check that you're on the right journey. And I think advice can provide that. I had a phone call recently with someone who's inquired through the podcast. And I think they hadn't quite realized the power of financial advice until they started listening to some of the bits and going, I didn't realize that. I didn't know that. That's going to change how I'm thinking about these things. And I think, there was a view that financial advisors were shiny suits, were salesmen, were trying to get more commission and that sort of thing. And it's done harm to the industry. So there's an element now of almost saying, what are we trying to do? We're trying to help people. We're trying to build long-term relationships. We're trying to problem solve together. And I think that's the key bit of almost saying to someone as early as possible, what do they want and what have they got? And almost like an MOT with a car, is everything fine? Or do we need to have a look at this in a year's time or 2 years' time? Or is it a case of, we need to change your car completely and set you up with something new that's going to be purpose-built for you?
Yeah, and I think most good financial advisors would have that initial chat with you and let you know whether advice is sort of needed and sort of that ongoing nature, or whether it is just a case of pointing you into the right direction.
Yeah, of course. I think that's exactly where guidance and advice, there might be a blurred line in the middle, but there's a crucial bit of just saying, start that process, ask the questions. Again, we love some of the questions we've had from listeners today. We can go through them with questions, we can answer them, we can sometimes say, let's dedicate a full episode to that. So I think that's what we're trying to do with the whole Retire Well podcast. And hopefully things like these case studies help, prompt people to think, that could be me, or that could be someone I know, and that could work. So jumping on to the next case study, we've got the idea of a high-earning professional who is moving to consultancy for a phased retirement while continuing to pay into a pension. So this answers, quite a common question of, can I, access a pension to achieve something, but still also pay into a pension going forward? And I think, consultancy is a real popular one where in high stress environments and high paid professions, there can be an element of saying, I'm not ready to sit and watch Loose Women in retirement, but I am ready to not be on the hamster wheel and not be going at 100 miles an hour. And I think the idea of working a few days a week or a few days a month, the flexibility with laptops and Teams calls now means that people can work anywhere around the world. And I've got a client who essentially has decided, he's had family members that have passed away and he's had friends that have not lived a full life expectancy. So he's gone, I want to make the most of retirement now, but I'm equally love my job. So he's gone from, working full time to dropping a day, and then thinking, actually, I'll be able to do, 1 day a week or a couple of days a month based in Spain, round a pool on a laptop, and still be able to, contribute into my pension going forward.
Yeah, I might have to have a chat with him about the episode and see if I can get a move to Spain as well.
I'm planning on doing the annual year over in Spain.
But no, I think this is it's a really good one, both from sort of funding the retirement if you're not quite there and you still want to sort of build it up, but equally from that sort of psychological point of view that we always speak about, where you can be retired for 27 days out of the month and just step in for those 3 days.
It comes back to, what does retirement mean?
Exactly.
Retirement doesn't have to be a cliff edge. It can be as flexible as you want it to be.
Yeah, and this, I think, again, even if it isn't sort of moving into sort of consultancy, if you are a high earning professional, you might actually be financially ready to retire, but you're not sort of ready to sort of move out of that straight away, that's when you can start looking at really maximising your pension contributions, or doing something similar in sort of contrast to that of have yourself a set amount where you essentially salary sacrifice a lot of your salary into your pension, and then almost make yourself live off savings for a year or two, which gets you used to sort of drawing off someone else or your money as opposed to someone else's money. And that's something that I can be really helpful to boost your savings while transitioning into that sort of life of living off your own money.
I think just one other bit on that case study as well is that idea of a high earner on paper can find retirement really challenging, because there's almost a point of, if the money keeps going up, then the spending keeps going up. But then retirement is the idea of that income source dries up. If we think about full traditional retirement, and you then go, I'm then spending my money. So, that's the bit that people might not think about how often they budget. They might not have looked about the expenditure, and their day-to-day spending might have sort of crept with them as their lifestyle's gone up. And do they want to sacrifice that lifestyle in retirement? Often the answer is no, but then it comes down to how much is enough. And sometimes the consultancy bit can say, okay, I'm going to keep busy, I'm going to do something I enjoy, but I'm going to do it at a slower pace, and that's going to cover the bills, when the pension, for example, can be turned on, or the ISAs can be turned on to flexibly find the extra bit of standard living, the holidays, the discretionary bit. So that can be the perfect phase. And then in doing that, then when they're getting closer to the full retirement and stopping work completely, they know more what they spend and how they can turn the taps back up.
Yeah, and something also to add to that, retirement isn't always just that sort of regular income that you're looking at. I've been speaking to someone that would probably fit similar into this category recently, where the high-performing managing director who's very much sick of that sort of part of their life and want to sort of move on, but they're definitely not retired, because now they're looking at sort of setting up a startup themselves.
Okay.
And that brings into almost sort of new issues, because potentially looking at using some of the pensions to actually fund a little bit of the startup. And it's, I suppose, all those just different things to think about, that if you're not stopping completely, what other bits might you need, and where can you take it from?
Yeah, definitely. And I think the other side of it as well, if we think about the next case study, is how some people haven't always got the choice of when to finish work. Again, redundancy is one we've talked about previously. And again, redundancy can sometimes kick people into retirement, but it can also kick them into doing a bit of that consultancy or changing the style of their job. But it's also a really stressful time, because, when we're talking about retirement planning in a traditional sense, it's on your terms. You're deciding when and how. Redundancy is that, okay, can you tell us by next week? Can you tell us in the next 2 weeks? Are you going to accept the voluntary? Do you want to move through to the next one and carry on working? Again, I think that's the bit that people can definitely need advice, but it can also be a really powerful example. I've helped someone over the years with redundancy where he was probably close to a mental breakdown in the sense of how hard he was working. And then actually in accepting the redundancy offer, he was able to start more of a hobby business with a passion, which could cover the bills and make a bit of money. But the redundancy element and the pension element was the backbone to allow him to do it. If that wasn't offered, he probably would have carried on that hamster wheel for as long as possible, because he didn't realize that he could and was ready to sort of phase into it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, redundancy is obviously very big, very scary, and a lot of the time comes at a shock to a lot of people. I find as well, I'll always say it can be an opportunity, a time for reflection, but also can be a financial opportunity that you won't always get. I was speaking to a few people recently, or someone that I'm specifically thinking about, where they've actually been offered a redundancy payment, and the redundancy payment wasn't massive. It wasn't sort of completely life-changing, but they were offered the chance to essentially accept the defined benefit that was linked to that unreduced.
Yeah.
And that was essentially sort of 5 years earlier than they might have been looking at. And I mean, again, there's no-brainers in financial advice, but it was definitely one to sort of look at and go in, when are we going to get this chance again? Even if I'm not ready to retire, to do this and potentially free up my spare time.
Definitely. And I think what happens in that moment is it forces someone to decide really what is the priority. Is it to carry on working and keeping the income, or is it to say, actually, I'm being offered, something that works for me, but also works for the company, which is the point of the redundancy. I think the real worry with redundancy is if you decline it and then you get a year down the line and you're back, your head's on the chopping board and the terms aren't quite as friendly and you feel like I've done the wrong thing. So I think it's really, like you say, a period of reflection. And I think you've said it really well. It's an opportunity. Again, it's stressful, but the opportunity is the next bit. My mum had a process. She was a teacher. She went through a potential redundancy process where they said, can you please tell us by next week if you want to be considered? And then she had to do some soul searching to say, am I ready to be retired? What comes next? We had this sort of conversation over a weekend. And when it came to it, they actually said, we can't replace you and therefore we can't offer you redundancy. But in going through that sort of mental process, she was actually then ready to finish. So it had helped her on the journey, even though it was a bit of a harsh journey for how she was, went through the process. Ultimately, the end result was, her time's more important than the salary. And what does she want to do in retirement starts to create those bucket lists and things to enjoy.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a sort of a good way to round off on the case studies, really sort of just look at those opportunities, and hopefully us speaking through this can generate a few comments sort of down below, and you can sort of chat amongst yourselves and ask us questions on sort of what potentially you might be able to and might be able to achieve. I'll sort of run through a listener's question before sort of wrapping up, and I think it's something that we've already answered quite a lot throughout this episode of sort of how we can structure stuff, but it's a question that happens a lot of sort of, I'm retiring before state pension age and early retirement. Do I need to be prioritised taking ISAs, or do I just rely on the pension? What's your general thoughts on that, Matthew?
I think the unpopular answer is everyone's situation is different, so you have to factor it in. But then the honest answer is also, you're trying to do what's right for you. You're trying to balance tax efficiency, longevity of funds. So for me, it's probably the TAP approach of what's the most tax efficient way to do it, and equally how much is in each one. If we imagine that someone's got, more in a pension than an ISA, you might say, well, we want that pension to certainly see me through between now and state pension, but I'm happy to then reduce that pension income as the state pension starts to keep that taxable income the same. If I then need more in the early years, we know that the ISAs are completely tax efficient, so I can almost have that ISA as the tax efficient bit on top. But equally, some people really love the idea of keeping a bit of the ISA for the lump sums. I'm going to change my car in a few years' time. That might come from the ISA. I'm going to make a gift to my daughter when she's getting married. That might come from the ISA. So I think it has to really be personalised to the individual, and it's going to be a bit of both is probably going to be the answer.
Yeah, I mean, a bit of a hospital pass for myself, to be honest, and there isn't an actual right answer there. But yeah, definitely a blend is sort of the right way forward. As always, if you do have any sort of other questions that you want us to look at, or sort of topics to explore on the videos, please let us know down in the comments, or equally send us an email at retirewell@wealthofadvice.co.uk. Hope you enjoyed this episode, and hope it sort of got you started to think about sort of the potential early retirement that you could do. And we look forward to seeing you again next week for the next episode.